Imagine waking up tomorrow, grabbing your phone to check the date, and finding out the government just completely outlawed Saturday and
I
Sunday.
mean, just erase them from existence.
Right, gone. And instead, you're mandated to live on a 10-day week. Oh, and, as you try to process that, you look at the time, and they've decreed that there are now only 10 hours in a day.
It really sounds like dystopian fiction, right?
Yeah,
Like something out of George Orwell or Aldous Huxley.
totally.
Because if you suddenly dictate that people work 9 days straight before getting a single day of rest, and that an hour stretches to, over 2 of our modern hours long feet, you aren't just changing a schedule. You are fundamentally disrupting the human body.
Yeah, and the social fabric, too. But it does sound like fiction, but this was actually a real legislated reality.
It was.
So today we're going on a deep dive into Mackie Shaw's extensive historical research on the French Republican calendar.
Which is such a wild topic.
It really is. This system was the actual law of the land in France from 1793 all the way to 1806. And, we aren't just looking at some quirky, forgotten historical footnote here.
No, not at all.
This is arguably the boldest, most radical attempt in human history to completely redesign human time.
And I think it's crucial to understand that for the French revolutionaries, changing the calendar was never just an exercise in measurement.
Right.
It was this ambitious, sweeping attempt to fundamentally rewire human consciousness. I mean, they genuinely believed that by controlling time, they could police society from the inside out.
Wow.
Yeah, they wanted to build an entirely new type of citizen, completely free from the past.
So our mission for this deep dive is to explore how these revolutionaries tried to literally reset the clock to what they called year one.
Which is just a crazy concept to begin with.
It really is. We're going to look at the massive cultural clashes it sparked, the absolute logistical chaos it caused in the streets and, the markets, and what this monumental failed experiment reveals about how time still controls you and me today.
Because time is just a social agreement.
Exactly. If a society agrees to change it, the entire framework of reality shifts.
But as the French quickly found out, getting millions of people to actually agree to a new reality requires a lot more than simply passing a decree in Paris.
Yeah, no kidding.
To really grasp how profoundly they broke the clock, we have to look at the world they were trying to break away from.
Yeah.
We have to understand how the French experienced time before 1789, back in the 18th century.
Right, because it wasn't the synchronized smartphone-driven world, today.
Not even close. Today your watch syncs to an atomic clock in Colorado. Back then, it was entirely different.
That makes sense, because pre-industrial time wasn't driven by electronics or train schedules. It was heavily dominated by the physical world, right?
Exactly. The sun, the seasons, the agricultural demands of the harvest.
Yeah, if you didn't have artificial light, your day pretty much ended when the sun went down.
Precisely. But beyond just the sun and the seasons, time was incredibly multi-layered. It varied wildly depending on your social class, your profession, your geography.
It wasn't uniform at all.
No. And what's fascinating here is how the sociologist Norbert Elias describes it. He has this brilliant concept where he calls time a social institution.
Okay, a social institution.
Yeah. So in the 18th century, time was basically a mechanism that underscored social relations and power structures.
Interesting.
If you look at the elite class, their time was entirely different from the time of a tradesman. Take the Palace of Versailles, for example.
Oh, right, the royals.
Right. There was this regal, fiercely etiquette-bound routine. The king's public rising from bed, the levee, his public dining, his retiring.
It was all a performance.
Exactly. These slow, deliberate rituals created the mystique of absolute power. For the aristocracy, leisure itself, the sheer abundance of unstructured time, was a signifier of dominance.
Okay, let's unpack this. So if you're a duke at Versailles, your time is marked by when you get to, hand the king his shirt.
Literally, yes.
But if you travel just a few miles into Paris, to the Bourse, the stock exchange, or just the city streets, it's a totally different universe.
Completely different.
There's this journalist from the era, Louis-Sébastien Mercier, and he described Paris as a noisy whirlwind. You had farmers rushing the gates at dawn to sell produce, lawyers hurrying to the courts, speculators running to the exchange.
It was frantic.
Right. For the artisan or the guild worker, time was incredibly fluid. It was based on the specific task at hand.
Task-oriented time.
Yeah. They might work intensely for 4 hours, take a break in a tavern in the middle of the day for 2 hours, and then return to work. It wasn't our standard 9-to-5 block.
Not at all. And layered on top of all of that was religious time. The traditional Gregorian calendar with all its saints' days, feast days, and Sundays, really dictated the rhythm of rest and celebration.
But we have to remember that the educated elite of the Enlightenment didn't view the Gregorian calendar as some, absolute scientific truth.
Right, because they knew its history. They were well aware it was a papal invention.
Right, Pope Gregory III back in 1582 just to fix the drift of the old Julian calendar.
Exactly. And the transition to that Gregorian calendar had been super messy. When the British finally adopted it in 1752, they literally had to skip 11 days just to catch up to the rest of Europe.
Imagine skipping 11 days.
It's wild. So the intellectual class of the 1700s knew that time could be manipulated. They also read widely about Islamic lunar calendars, Jewish calendars, and other global alternatives.
Yeah, didn't they have reports from travelers in Iceland too?
They did. Travelers noted that locals in Iceland divided the day into 8 quote-unquote hours based entirely on the position of the sun relative to specific landmarks on the mountains or the sea. Time was totally malleable.
So if we think about 18th century time, it's really like this massive, chaotic symphony where everyone is playing at a slightly different tempo.
That's a great way to put it.
And nobody's looking at the same conductor. The
Yeah.
peasant, the priest, and the aristocrat are literally experiencing completely different dimensions of time.
Absolutely. The priest is tracking the liturgical calendar. The peasant is tracking the frost and the harvest moon.
The aristocrat is tracking court rituals.
And the merchant in Paris is just tracking the arrival of the mail coach.
It's a perfect analogy. And the instrument cutting through all of those different tempos, slowly trying to harmonize them, was the mechanical clock.
Yes. For Enlightenment thinkers, the mechanical clock was so much more than a tool. It was a profound metaphor.
A metaphor for what, exactly?
It represented rationality,
Yeah.
order, universal harmony. Philosophers love the idea of the universe as a perfectly calibrated piece of clockwork, perhaps set in motion by a rational, supreme being.
Oh, I see.
They became obsessed with this idea of chronometric exactitude, the belief that human affairs could be organized with the same flawless precision as a brass gear train.
So you have this chaotic temporal soup, all these overlapping, messy rhythms of life. And into the soup, the French Revolution just erupts.
It does.
By 1792, they've overthrown the monarchy. They're dismantling the church's power. They have this radical, explosive desire for a completely blank slate.
They wanted to start over completely.
Right. The old regime is dead, and so, by their logic, the old regime's calendar must die too. You can't build a new utopia using the Pope's clock.
You really can't, especially not from their ideological standpoint. If your entire political project is about erasing what they explicitly called the night of ferocity and barbarity.
Wow, strong words.
Very strong, meaning the centuries of Catholic and monarchical rule, you have to sever the temporal link to that past. So in late 1793, the revolutionary government formally birthed the Republican calendar.
And in a brilliant stroke of propaganda, they made it retroactive.
Yes, they did.
They declared that September 22, 1792 was the official start of year week. I just find that backdating absolutely fascinating. They literally hit the reset button on human history.
They did?
September 22, 1792 was the day the Republic was officially founded. But it wasn't just a political date, right? It perfectly coincided with the autumnal equinox in Paris.
Which was incredibly important to them. They were rooting their new political reality in an undeniable astronomical event.
Tying it to nature.
Exactly. The founding of their republic aligned perfectly with the cosmos, and from there, they constructed a calendar that was astonishingly rigid and mathematical.
They just threw out the messy Gregorian months, right?
Yep. Those old months that inexplicably varied between 28, 30, and 31 days. Gone. In this new system, you get 12 perfectly equal months of exactly 30 days each.
And within those months, the traditional 7-day week is completely abolished.
Completely.
The whole concept of Monday through Sunday is just gone. Instead, the 30-day month is divided into 3 10-day weeks. They called these 10-day weeks decades.
So your month is just 3 weeks long. Every single month follows the exact same pattern. It's a triumph of decimal logic.
But wait, as anyone doing the math right now will realize, 12 months of 30 days only gets you to 360 days.
Right. The Earth, unfortunately for the Jacobins, stubbornly takes roughly 365.25 days to orbit the sun.
Yeah, you can't just legislate the Earth to speed up its orbit.
It really can't.
So what did they do with those leftover 5 or 6 days at the end of the year?
They just corralled them. They tacked the remaining 5 days or 6 in a leap year onto the very end of the calendar year, right before the next autumnal equinox.
Just floating at the end there.
Yeah. They initially called these days the Sans Tides.
Ah, named after the sans culottes.
Exactly. The radical working-class revolutionaries of Paris who wore long trousers instead of aristocratic knee breeches.
Right.
And these 5 days weren't part of any month. They were dedicated entirely to national festivals. You had a day celebrating virtue, a day for genius, a day for labor, a day for opinion, and a day for rewards.
It's just so clinical and engineered.
Highly engineered.
This entire system was designed by a committee of scientists, mathematicians, and politicians, right? You had key figures like Charles Gilbert Rome, a politician with a strong scientific background, and Antoine Arbogast, a prominent mathematician.
Yeah, they treated time like an engineering problem that needed to be solved.
They really did.
Because this was the ultimate expression of the Enlightenment's absolute obsession with the decimal system and the natural sciences. Remember, this is the exact same era and often the exact same committees that invented the metric system.
Right. The meter and the kilogram.
Exactly. They were standardizing weights and measures, and they just applied that identical decimal logic to time. They truly believed they were placing the political world in perfect, rational harmony with the natural world.
Because the old calendar was seen as corrupt.
Corrupt, arbitrary, stained by the blood of kings and the superstitions of popes. But this new calendar, it was universally true. It was tied to the earth, the sun, and the pure logic of the number 10.
But, I mean, the theory is one thing. Trying to actually roll this massive bureaucratic shift out across an entire country in the 1790s without the internet, without telegraphs.
Oh, it was a nightmare.
The logistical friction must have been unbelievable.
The bureaucratic chaos was off the charts. Imagine you are a local administrator in a rural province.
Okay.
You receive a decree from Paris stating that it is no longer October 1793. It is suddenly year 2 of the Republic.
Just out of nowhere.
Yeah, and you have to translate all legal documents, birth certificates, and tax records into a system you don't even fully understand yet.
Wow.
We have records of places like Toulouse waiting weeks for the nail coaches just to deliver the official spellings of the new months.
That is wild. And think about the financial contracts. If I signed a promissory note agreeing to pay you back in exactly 60 days, but suddenly the length of weeks and the months have entirely changed,
No.
when is my debt due?
It's a legal nightmare.
Or imagine trying to coordinate a shipment of grain when half your trading partners are stubbornly clinging to the 7-day week, and the other half, usually the government officials, are strictly using the 10-day decade.
Exactly.
One merchant says, I expect the flour on Tuesday, and the Republican official says, I'm sorry, Tuesday doesn't exist. I only recognize the 3rd day of the first decade. The supply chains must have just ground to a halt.
They absolutely did. And this chaos didn't stay neatly contained within the borders of France either. The calendar marched outward at the tip of the bayonets of the revolutionary arms.
Really? They forced it on other countries?
Oh, yeah. When the French conquered the Dutch Republic, they rebranded it the Batavian Republic and forced the Republican calendar upon them, publishing these extensive instructional manuals in Dutch on how to calculate the new dates.
Wow.
They pushed it into the deeply Catholic Italian peninsula, too, forcing papal states to suddenly operate on this secular 10-day grid.
But passing a law, or even enforcing it with an army, doesn't actually change the culture.
No, it doesn't.
If the Jacobins wanted the ordinary peasant or shopkeeper to actually embrace this incredibly sterile mathematical system, they couldn't just rely on force and decrees. They needed poetry. They needed to make the math beautiful.
That is exactly the realization the government came to. You cannot win the hearts of the public with pure decimal logic. You have to sell the new reality to the public imagination.
You have to change how people fundamentally feel about the passage of the year.
Right. Which brings us to the massive cultural rebranding of year 2. They brought in a man named Fabre d'Églantine. He wasn't a mathematician, he was a playwright and a poet.
Ah, a creative type.
Exactly. He was the one tasked with giving names to these 12 new equal months. And instead of keeping names like January, February, or March, which were rooted in Roman gods and emperors, he based the new names entirely on the natural weather patterns and agricultural seasons of France.
His nomenclature is actually quite beautiful.
It really is.
For the autumn months, you have Vendémiaire, the month of the vintage or the grape harvest. Then Brumaire, the month of mist and fog. Then Frimaire, the month of frost.
And moving into spring, you have Germinal, the month of seeding and germination. Floreal, the month of flowers. Prairial, the month of meadows.
And in summer, Thermidor, the month of intense heat. It sounds so poetic, but there was a deeply calculated psychological strategy behind this, wasn't there?
Oh, absolutely.
Because the sources mention that this was heavily rooted in Lockean epistemology.
Yes, and this is where the intellectual history gets so fascinating. John Locke was an English philosopher, and his essay concerning human understanding was hugely influential on the French Enlightenment.
Okay, so what was his main theory?
Locke argued against innate ideas. He posited the concept of the tabula rasa, the blank slate. He argued that all human memory, knowledge, and even morality are built entirely from external sensory experiences and the associations we make with images and words.
So if we apply Locke's blank slate to the calendar, the Jacobins are looking at the Gregorian calendar and realizing it's a massive psychological weapon.
Bingo.
Every single day of the old calendar was named after a Catholic saint. St. John's Day, St. Martin's Day. If people are constantly repeating those names, their minds are trapped in a religious framework.
Exactly. Fabre-d'Églantine explicitly argued that the old calendar filled the people's memories with superstitious and fanatical images.
He wanted to wipe the slate clean.
Yes. He believed that if you change the vocabulary of daily life, if you force a farmer to talk about mist and sieves instead of saints and martyrs, you are literally rewriting the mental landscape of the population.
That's incredibly ambitious.
By replacing religious fiction with rational agricultural realities, they believed they were scientifically engineering a more rational, grounded human being.
It's essentially the biggest corporate rebranding campaign in human history.
It really is.
They're aggressively stripping out all the old, problematic intellectual property of the Catholic Church, and they are rolling out this sleek, new, nature-based aesthetic, and they use every single tool of media and culture available to push this rebrand.
They absolutely flooded the zone. The government commissioned visual artists, prominent engravers like Lafitte and Tresca, to create these beautiful mass-produced prints.
To replace the old imagery.
Right. Instead of the old royal almanacs that just showed the king in ermine robes looking down from heaven, these new engravings depicted the figure of liberty situated in lush, pastoral, agrarian isles. They personified the new months as robust farmers and idealized peasants.
And they utilized theater and performance heavily, too. The stage was basically the mass media of the 1790s.
Oh, yeah.
There was a popular play performed in Paris called L'Heureuse Decade, the Happy Decade. It was essentially state-sponsored propaganda promoting the virtue of the citizen farmer who works diligently for the Republic for 9 days and rests joyfully on the 10th.
The spectacles could get quite elaborate. In Bordeaux, there are records of a civic ballet staged to celebrate the calendar.
A ballet for a calendar.
Yeah. The month of Vendémiaire was represented on stage by a female dancer wearing flesh-toned trousers, draped head to toe in actual vines and grapes, dancing a pantomime of the harvest.
It's so bizarre, but you can clearly see the strategy. And what I find so ironic is that these radical revolutionaries, who were often deeply suspicious of wealth, effectively used consumer capitalism to sell their utopia.
They really did.
There was a massive boom in everyday consumer goods designed to normalize the calendar. Printers made fortunes selling Republican almanacs and playing cards with revolutionary symbols. And my favorite detail, the montre économique.
The economical watch.
Yes, because people couldn't afford to buy entirely new watches to track the new time, clever entrepreneurs printed cheap paper dials with the new 10-hour or decimal marking.
Just paper dials.
Yeah, you could just buy one for a few pennies, pop the glass off your old pocket watch, and stick the paper dial right over the old 24-hour face. They were literally selling the revolution, monetizing the new concept of time.
If we pull back and connect this to the bigger picture, the Jacobin leadership realized that the land, the weather, and the seasons were not just neutral meteorological facts.
Right.
They were deeply moral tools. Leaders like Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just genuinely believed that agriculture and a physical connection to the soil were the true mothers of good morals.
So the city was seen as bad?
Yeah, the city was seen as a place of aristocratic corruption and aristocratic commerce. The farm was pure. This agrarian ideal was supposed to literally grow virtue in the citizenry. By aligning the national calendar with the harvest cycle, they were trying to align the soul of every citizen with the survival of the republic.
But this beautiful, pastoral, theoretically perfect agrarian rebranding was about to slam headfirst into a brick wall.
A massive brick wall.
And that brick wall was the single most deeply rooted habit in all of European history: religion, and specifically, the beloved Sunday. Now, before we dive into this part, we should make it clear to you listening that we are taking a strictly neutral, impartial stance here.
Yes, absolutely.
We are merely reporting the fierce historical struggle between the Jacobin state and the Catholic Church based on the source material. We're not endorsing either ideology.
Right. We're just looking at how these two massive, uncompromising worldviews collided. You had the Jacobin state, which believed it was saving humanity through pure secular rationality, colliding head-on with a Catholic tradition that had defined the spiritual, social, and physical rhythms of European life for over 1,000 years.
It's a clash of titans.
It wasn't just a disagreement about what day to take off. It was a battle for the ultimate authority over human life.
And the way this battle played out in the popular culture of the streets was often through pamphlets and satirical dialogues. There was a very famous, widely circulated comedic dialogue featuring two fictional characters.
Right, Monsieur Dimanche and Citoyen Decadi.
Exactly. Monsieur Dimanche, Mr. Sunday, who represented the old, comforting Catholic tradition, and Citoyen Decadi, Citizen 10th Day, who represented the cold, sterile, highly logical New Republic.
That dialogue is a perfect primary source because it captures the massive cultural friction of the moment. In the pamphlets, Monsieur Dimanche argued that his day of rest had survived since the biblical deluge.
A long resume.
Yeah. He argued that Sunday was hale, hearty, and brought comfort, community, and spiritual nourishment to the weary poor. Citoyen Decadi retorted with cold logic, arguing that the new decimal system was scientifically rational, mathematically sound, and rid the country of ancient superstitions.
But while they were debating in pamphlets on the ground, this was not a polite comedic debate.
Not at all.
It was a brutal physical campaign of dechristianization, which really reached its peak in year 2 of the Republic. The calendar wasn't just a way to measure grapes and mist. It became a literal weapon used by the state against the church.
It was deployed as a tool of erasure. In radicalized areas, local revolutionary committees used the new 10-day week to explicitly mock and destroy Catholic infrastructure.
Like what happened in Nancy.
Yes, in the town of Nancy, local revolutionaries deliberately gathered on the Decadine, the new 10th day of rest, and dragged church confessionals out into the public square.
Oh, wow.
They chopped them up and burned them in a bonfire right at the foot of the guillotine. They were actively, violently trying to replace the Christian Sabbath with this new state-sponsored civic religion of reason.
But the people's resistance to this was incredibly fierce and deeply stubborn. You can burn a confessional, but you cannot easily burn the habit of Sunday out of a peasant's mind.
You really can't.
Ordinary people simply refused to let go of their traditional day of rest. In a place called Havre Libre, which, by the way, was the new, heavily sanitized revolutionary name for a traditional town in the Somme, the villagers just ignored the new calendar.
They just kept living their lives.
Yeah. They continued to dress up and celebrate Sundays with dances, feasts, and games in the village square. And they openly, loudly mocked the so-called patriots, or local officials who only observed the new, boring Republican festivals on the Decady.
The pushback was immense. And it wasn't just villagers stubbornly dancing in the square. There was a highly intellectual, sophisticated theological and legal counterattack mounted by the clergy who had remained in France. A key figure here is constitutional Bishop Lacoze.
Lacoze is fascinating because he didn't just quote the Bible at the revolutionaries. He used their own revolutionary logic against them.
Exactly. Lacoze made a brilliant, legally grounded argument. He appealed directly to the revolution's own founding document, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen.
Turning their own words against them.
Yep. He argued that forcing Catholic priests to transfer the Holy Mass from Sunday to the new Decady was a blatant violation of constitutional rights. The Declaration guaranteed freedom of religious opinion. Lacoste stated that the state dictating the specific day of spiritual worship crossed the line from civic administration into outright tyranny.
But Bishop Lacoste has a brilliant point there. He's using the Republic's own constitution to trap them. Legally, the government in power during the later 1790s is cornered. So what do? Because they can't exactly admit he's right without completely abandoning their brand new calendar.
They respond the way threatened states often respond, with a massive authoritarian crackdown.
Of course.
The Directory launched an aggressive campaign of surveillance and coercion. They actively hunted down priests who continued to hold secret Sunday masses. They forced clergy to sign loyalty oaths to the Republic and tried to physically intimidate them into transferring all religious services to the 10th day.
And the social cost of that crackdown was devastating. It literally ripped local communities apart. You suddenly had a surveillance state mobilized to monitor what day of the week people chose to relax.
It's terrifying.
Communes were encouraged to report on their own neighbors. If you were caught wearing your clean Sunday best clothes on a traditional Sunday, you could be reported for a lack of Republican zeal.
Just for wearing nice clothes.
Right. If a local tavern owner closed his doors on a Sunday out of respect for the traditional Sabbath, he could be fined or arrested as an enemy of the state. How exactly do you police a day of the week across an entire nation?
It's an administrative nightmare.
It is. If someone is just sitting quietly in their house on a Sunday reading a book or resting, are they committing treason? Are the gendarmes going to knock down the door and demand they go back to work?
It was impossible. And the government soon realized that the spiritual battle was failing. They could not force people to worship the Republic. So they decided to switch tactics.
What did they do?
If they couldn't win the souls of the citizenry, they would hit them where it hurt the most. Their wallets, their stomachs, and their physical exhaustion. Which brings us to the intense policing of work, labor, and markets.
Right. This is where the sheer mathematical flaw of the Republican calendar stops being an abstract problem and becomes a physical crisis for the working class.
Because of the rest days.
Exactly. Under the old Gregorian system, with its 7-day week, workers enjoyed 52 Sundays off every year, plus a handful of major religious feast days. But under the new decimal system, with its 10-day decade, you only get 1 day of rest every 10 days. That math means you only get 36 rest days a year.
It was a brutal reduction in leisure time. And the Republicans in Paris actually saw this as a feature, not a bug.
Wait, really?
Yeah. They believed the old Catholic calendar had way too many holidays, which they thought encouraged idleness and drunkenness. They thought the 10-day week would drastically increase national productivity and industrial output.
But they were completely ignoring human biology. Imagine your HR department suddenly sending out an email today saying, "Great news! We've optimized the company calendar for maximum productivity. Starting tomorrow, you will work 9 days straight before getting a single day off."
People would riot.
The burnout would be catastrophic. People would literally collapse. And that is exactly what happened to the French working class. They couldn't physically sustain 9 days of manual labor without a break.
So the workers rebelled, and they did so in the most pragmatic, economically damaging way possible. They engaged in massive, quiet strikes.
Yes, the phenomenon of the cordonnier démanchier, the Sunday shoemaker. This is such a great detail.
It illustrates the chaos perfectly. Imagine a guild of shoemakers in a city like Lyon. You have some workers who are loyal to the Republic and follow the new calendar, resting on the decade.
Okay.
And you have others, the Sunday shoemakers, who stubbornly stick to the old Gregorian rest day. What happened in practice was that the traditionalist would convince his Republican colleagues to take Sunday off with him.
Oh, I see where this is going.
All right, they'd all go to the tavern. But then a few days later, when the Republicans' official rest day, the decade, rolled around, the traditionalists would say, "Well, I can't work alone," and he would take that day off too.
They were double dipping.
Exactly.
They weaponized the confusion to take both the old weekend and the new weekend off. The government tried to steal 16 days of rest from them, and the workers ended up taking even more time off than before.
The economic impact of this widespread double-dipping was absolutely staggering. Contemporary economists and government officials frantically tried to calculate the damage.
How bad was it?
Some estimated that this stubborn adherence to both systems of time cost the French economy something in the realm of 160 million livres annually in lost labor, stalled manufacturing, and reduced productivity.
160 million livres. So the state is just bleeding money. The Directory has to step in again. And they pass these incredibly draconian directorial laws. They legally mandate that all shops, regardless of the owner's beliefs, must be closed on the decade.
Right, forcing compliance.
If you open your bakery on the 10th day, you're fined. But they didn't stop at just closing shops. They completely disrupted the food supply by forcing all the local market days to change.
This was their most aggressive economic weapon. For centuries, rural life and agricultural survival revolved around deeply entrenched local market days. A specific town might have held its grain market every Wednesday and Saturday since the Middle Ages.
Everyone knew the schedule.
Exactly. The farmers knew when to travel, the bakers knew when to buy. The Directory abruptly forced municipalities to reschedule these ancient markets. They mandated that markets must fall on the 4th day, the Quartidi, or the 9th day, the Nonidi, of the new 10-day week.
And the explicit goal of moving the markets to the 4th and 9th days was purely malicious toward the Catholic tradition, right? They wanted to ensure that people had to work, travel, or trade on the days immediately surrounding or landing on the traditional Sunday, breaking their ability to observe the Sabbath.
Exactly. It was engineered inconvenience. But the result on the ground was total, life-threatening chaos. This raises an important question about state control because in the Haute-Garonne region, this policy caused such a catastrophe that historian Jack Thomas refers to it as the purgatorial month of Messidor in year 6.
What happened?
The local administrators banned the old market schedules, but the farmers refused to adapt to the new ones or simply didn't understand the new dates. The result: the farmers didn't bring their grain to the cities. The cities experienced immediate, massive food shortages. People were facing starvation simply because of a calendar dispute.
So what do starving people do? They ignore the law. They hold illegal rogue markets on the days they actually understand. The sources describe an event in the town of Montreuil.
Right, the illegal market.
The government had canceled the traditional market day, but 4,000 peasants and merchants showed up anyway. 4,000 people defying the national government, setting up stalls, trading grain and livestock, and the local gendarmes, the armed police, were completely powerless.
They really were.
You can't arrest 4,000 people who are just trying to buy bread on a Tuesday.
You can't. And this specific incident in Montreuil highlights a profound historical irony. What we see happening here is the Revolutionary Era, the era that supposedly brought liberty to the people, actually completing a long-held tyrannical goal of the old absolute monarchy.
Which was?
The total nationalization of time. The central government in Paris was now aggressively dictating the hyperlocal economic rhythms of villages hundreds of miles away. They were treating a local farmer's traditional day of selling cabbages as an act of political treason against the Republic. It was an unprecedented, staggering level of state intervention into the microscopic minutiae of daily human life.
And if messing with the days of the week caused 4,000-person riots and crashed the national economy, we have to look at what happened when they tried to chop up the hours of the day itself. Because, incredibly, they didn't just stop at the calendar, they went straight for the clock.
They did. This is the decree for decimal time. The ideological momentum was so strong that they felt if the week was going to be perfectly metric, the day had to be metric as well.
Of course they did.
So the government officially decreed that from then on, a full day from midnight to midnight would consist of exactly 10 hours. Each of those new hours would be divided into 100 decimal minutes, and each of those minutes would be divided into 100 decimal seconds.
Okay, we really need to unpack the physical math of this because trying to map this onto how we experience a day just breaks my brain.
It's hard to conceptualize.
If there are only 10 hours in a day instead of 24, that means one of their new decimal hours has to cover a massive chunk of the day. Mathematically, a single decimal hour is equal to 2.4 of our regular hours. That is nearly 2.5 hours long. And a decimal minute, since there are fewer of them in the day, is actually about a minute and a half of regular time. Imagine standing in a town square, staring up at a clock face, and having to wait 144 normal seconds just for the minute hand to tick forward a single space. It would feel like time was moving through molasses.
It would. And beyond the psychological disorientation, implementing this required entirely new, incredibly complex machinery. You cannot simply paint new numbers on an old clock.
Right, the mechanics inside have to change.
Exactly. Mechanical clocks rely on the precise mathematics of gear ratios and escapements based on the number 24. To change to a 10-hour cycle, you have to cut entirely new brass wheels with different numbers of teeth. In 1794, the revolutionary government actually held a massive public competition at the Louvre to design these new decimal timepieces.
They brought in the heavyweights of 18th century science for this, didn't they?
They did. The jury assessing the designs included Ferdinand Berthoud, who was arguably one of the greatest marine chronometer makers in history, and the brilliant mathematician Joseph Louis Lagrange.
So, top-tier talent.
Yeah, this jury of geniuses painstakingly examined 191 different mechanical plans, trying to figure out how to physically adapt the intricate gears of springs, pendulums, and striking bells to this entirely new 10-hour reality.
And it wasn't just about making fancy new pocket watches for wealthy politicians in Paris. They tried to force this onto public time, which meant altering massive, ancient tower clocks. There is that incredible story about the Capitol building in
Oh,
Toulouse.
that's a perfect example.
The local administrator spent 4 grueling months paying mechanics to meticulously alter the massive gears of the town clock so the dial on the outside of the building would display the new 10-hour decimal time.
But there was a fatal mechanical flaw. The visual dial is driven by one set of gears, but the massive bells that chime the hour across the city are driven by an entirely separate, highly complex cam and lever system called a striking train.
Right, and the striking train was too complex, too physically massive for the local mechanics to rebuild, so they ended up with a schizophrenic clock.
Pretty much.
The hands on the outside of the building pointed to the new decimal time, say 5 o'clock in the decimal afternoon, but the bells inside were still mechanically trapped in the old system, so they would ring out the traditional 24-hour time. It must have driven the citizens of Toulouse completely mad. You look at the clock and it says one thing, but your ears hear a completely different reality.
The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. Decimal time was almost universally despised. It was simply too confusing, too alienating, and far too expensive to retrofit the entire physical infrastructure of European timekeeping. Because of this absolute failure on the ground, decimal time was officially suspended by 1795, barely a year and a half after it was introduced.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Decimal time completely failed publicly, but the massive disruption it caused secretly kick-started something huge. The chaos of trying to build these 10-hour clocks actually birthed the modern French mass watchmaking industry.
This is one of the most vital unintended consequences of the revolution. Because the luxury watch trade in Paris was totally disrupted by the terror and the confusing decrees, a Swiss immigrant named Laurent Mégevin saw an opportunity.
What did he do?
He moved away from Paris, settling in Besançon, near the Swiss border. With the backing of the revolutionary government, he established a massive, nationalized watchmaking factory, bringing thousands of skilled Swiss clockmakers with him.
And this wasn't just a traditional guild workshop. Mégevin was building proto-factories. And inside these factories in Besançon, the management fully aggressively embraced the new 10-day Republican week. And they used it against the workers. The sources note that the workers were forced to fill out these documents called comptes décadaires. What exactly were those?
Comptes décadaires translate to 10-day accounts or 10-day quotas. Management used the rigid mathematical structure of the decade to strictly measure and demand a specific output of watch parts every 10 days. If a worker didn't meet their decimal quota by the end of the decade, they were penalized.
Oh, wow. So this is the exact moment everything changes. We were talking earlier about the artisan in Paris. The guy who worked for a few hours, went to the tavern, and worked until the job was done. That was task time.
Exactly.
But here in Besançon, time becomes a weapon of management. This is the birth of modern work discipline. Time is no longer tied to the sun or the completion of a physical task. Time is a rigid, mathematical grid used by capitalists to measure human output and extract labor.
You've hit the nail on the head. This is the psychological transition into the Industrial Revolution. The Republican calendar failed as a cultural project, but its obsession with quantifying time perfectly laid the groundwork for industrial capitalism. Management realized that if you standardize time, you can standardize and optimize human labor.
That is absolutely chilling, but it makes perfect sense. Think about that the next time you are filling out your weekly timesheets, or clocking in and out of a shift, or sitting in a meeting about meeting your quarterly production quotas. That exact mentality, that specific transactional relationship between time and human labor, was incubated right there on the factory floors of Besançon, born out of the absolute chaos of the French Revolution. They were literally inventing the modern concept of the work week.
And yet, despite that hidden legacy in the factories, the grand public experiment of the French Republican calendar was doomed. It officially died on January 1st, 1806.
Napoleon.
Exactly. Napoleon Bonaparte was in power. He had already signed a concordat with the Pope, essentially making peace with the Catholic Church and bringing them back into the fold of the state to secure his own political stability. As part of that stabilization, Napoleon quietly signed the decree that dragged France back into the Gregorian system.
So the 10-day week is dead. Sunday is officially back. The year 1806 exists once again, and year 4th is wiped from the books. But did the calendar actually fail? I mean, it was erased from the law books, but did it disappear from the culture?
Bureaucratically and legally, it was a colossal failure. It was too complex, deeply unpopular, and totally disconnected from the ingrained psychological and spiritual habits of the population. But culturally and politically, it left a massive, indelible scar on history. The poetic month names that Favre-d'Églantine invented lived on for over a century
Yeah.
as incredibly powerful political shorthand for radical change.
They really did. You see it everywhere in later French culture. If you read Émile Zola's masterpiece novel Germinal, published in the 1880s, which is all about a brutal, violent coal miner strike and the political awakening of the working class, that title is a direct, deliberate callback to the revolutionary month of spring, of seeds germinating beneath the earth. He's using the calendar to symbolize a new revolution growing in the dark. Or Victorian Sardou's play Thermidor, which caused actual riots when it premiered. The words themselves retained an electric revolutionary charge.
And its influence went far beyond literature.
Yeah.
Later radical political movements looked back at the 1790s experiment with absolute awe. During the European revolutions of 1848, during the Paris Commune of 1871, where they actually reinstated the calendar briefly, and even all the way to the Bolsheviks in Russia in 1917. All of these revolutionaries saw the French Republican calendar as the ultimate blueprint.
The blueprint for what?
It proved a vital concept. If you want to truly create a new era, if you want to birth a new society, you must literally seize control of the mechanism of time itself.
It proved that the state could intervene in time. It laid the conceptual groundwork for things we completely take for granted today. Think about standardized national holidays. Think about government-regulated weekends and maximum-hour work weeks. Think about secular civic calendars that aren't tied to a church or a religious festival. The revolutionary government realized, hey, we have the power to dictate exactly when millions of people rest and exactly when they work, on a massive national scale.
Exactly. It was the ultimate unprecedented assertion of secular state power over the biological and social rhythms of human life. From the fluid, localized, seasonal time of the 18th century, where the village bell and the sun ruled your day, to the rigidly policed, mathematically sterile decaded, the state had learned how to wield the calendar as an instrument of total control. And once governments learn a trick like that, they never truly forget it.
It is just a staggering historical journey, from the messy symphony of priests and peasants overlapping in time to an entire nation trying to force nature itself into a 10 by 10 decimal grid, to the grueling factory timesheets we all still fill out today. Thank you so much for joining us and walking us through Matthew Shaw's fascinating research. It's an incredible story of hubris, math, and the stubbornness of the human spirit.
It was a pleasure to unpack it. It really does make you look at the watch on your wrist and the structure of your upcoming weekend in a completely different, slightly more suspicious light.
It absolutely does. And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over. If you were granted the absolute power to completely redesign the calendar today, right now, to perfectly reflect modern humanity's highest values, what would it look like? Would you stick with the 7 days we inherited from ancient Babylon and Rome simply because it's what we know? Or would you try a 10-day week if the new government guaranteed you a 3-day weekend at the end of it? How would you rename the months to reflect the reality of the 21st century? It is something to think about the next time you look at your watch, waiting patiently for Friday to arrive.